All right. Hey, I'm Kelsey Hightower. I'm happy to be here at Sprint. I'm going to be talking a little bit about my initial experience with NGINX Unit. Specifically, I want to show you how I downloaded it and used it in my environment. So some of you may know I'm a big Golang programmer. So I wanted to put NGINX Unit to the test to see how it works for me. I think the best way to do that, pretty sure you all want some slides, but I'm going to do it by sharing my screen. So let me do that first. All right. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about the last time I was speaking at an NGINX conference. It's about 7 years ago, and I wrote this tool called Motorboat. And the thing about Motorboat, what it did was it gave me a way to dynamically synchronize my applications that were running in the hot container orchestration platform back then, Kubernetes, with NGINX. Now, the challenge was NGINX didn't really have a great programmable API. So I had to do some weird things to synchronize the stuff that was in my orchestration tool or with the configuration into NGINX. I won't deep dive in here, but 7 years ago, building little tools like this were necessary. We called these sidecars back then. It was a great way for us to kind of add functionality to existing products and services, in this case, NGINX. So the first thing I wanted to do was playing with NGINX these days, is something like Motorboat still necessary? Or does NGINX have a better way of dealing with this config file, ideally programmably over some HTTP API? Now, of course, my venture was into NGINX Unit. Others may have a ton of experience in NGINX Unit, but it's new to me. And one of the first things it talks about is that it actually has solved this one particular problem. I don't have to necessarily deal with config files if I don't want to. Well, that's interesting. But more interesting than that is this component here. I'm going to zoom my screen up a little bit here. This part, NGINX Unit, is a polyglot application server. Well, the only experience I have with application servers are things like JBoss and WebLogic, but that's from way back in the day. So what's NGINX Unit's take on this? My number one goal from an application server, it needs to just save me time. The less code I write, the better. So that's going to be kind of my requirement. That's what I'm going to be looking at from NGINX Unit. Does it actually allow me to do those things? And if so, then we're going to be off to a good start here. All right, the next thing that we need to do is figure out the application we want to write. Now, look, I like to keep things simple. Now, one thing that I'm curious about is how does it handle the simple case of hello world? And also, what if I want to build applications in different ways? Microservices, monoliths, you name it. There's plenty of ways of doing this. Well, so one thing that got me really interested was, how does NGINX dealing with low backend applications? So I clicked over to the configuration section and I found applications. Look, that's what I'm most interested in. I know people think about NGINX typically as a load balancer, part of your infrastructure stack, but I was more curious for this particular presentation, how it works for my applications. So I got in here and I saw, wow, it has support for my favorite programming language, which is Golang. And one thing I asked myself is, does my app have to change? Well, for the most part, if you look at the docs, you can write normal HTTP applications and then use the unit library as a drop-in replacement for the standard library listen and serve HTTP handler. Okay, this looks pretty straightforward to me. So I'm going to pop over to some code that I wrote. Now, my ultimate destination with all of this, honestly, is to try to get this hosted on a serverless platform. I know you all were thinking about maybe he's going to put it into something like Kubernetes. Nah, we're going to do something slightly different this time. What I want to do now is try to run this application in a serverless environment. Today, I'm going to try to get it to run in Cloud Run. Now, here's the interesting thing. Cloud Run only supports one application at a time. But what if I have a bunch of small applications? Is this something that NGINX Unit can help with? To give you an example of what I have in mind here, I'm going to show you a little bit of code. First, I have a normal HTTP website or HTML, and it's just a static file. You know, my experience, NGINX is really good at hosting static content. So if I just want a static web page, or maybe you're doing something more advanced with JavaScript, you can drop this static file in there, NGINX can host it. But the more complex thing that I want to do is just write my app in my favorite programming language, Golang. And in this case, I'm going to follow those instructions. I'm going to import the NGINX Go library. I'm just going to write a very simple web handler. You can kind of see it here. Just hello world. One thing I'm doing just to make sure that it's hitting my app, I'm going to write this little header called application name. called Hello World. And all it's going to do is print to the screen, Hello World. All right, so let's do this. Let's build this application really quickly. I have a little script to help me out to move a bit faster. So we're just going to call this build command. And all it's going to do is build my application. Now, to test out this multiple application support, I'm actually going to have another little application to the side. And all it's going to do is respond to health checks. So when you hit this particular application, it's just going to say, OK. And its application name is going to be set to health check. Now, to make sure that these two apps don't conflict with each other, I'm going to run on port 9091 for the health check service and port 9090 for the Hello World service. This is mainly because I just want to run these two binaries on my local laptop. So let's test these out really quickly to make sure they work. All right, so real quick, we're just going to run the Hello World binary. All right, make sure in the right directory. And let's build our application for my Mac OS. So we'll do bin scripts, and then we'll build our application. All right, so we should now have two binaries. We should have a Hello World and a Hello World health check. All right, so if I look at my bin directory, we can see these two binaries. And what I'm going to do now is we're just going to run those here. So I just have another terminal. And what I'm going to do is call bin hello world. Make sure that it's running. You'll notice something really cool here. When this app isn't running in NGINX Unit, it ignores the NGINX Unit bindings and just binds to a normal port. I got a hint it's going to do something different once it's running underneath NGINX Unit. Just pop over to curl, make sure that this works. Now I'm going to hit this on port 9090, and it says hello world. And if we want to verify that header is working, we can do that too really quickly. All right, so there's the first app. Makes sense to me. Now, the other thing that I want to do is run the other application, which is the health check one. Now, you notice that I'm doing something weird here. Instead of combining these two web handlers into a single binary, I'm literally splitting them into nano services, if you will. These are just small services that only do one thing. So single route, single functionality. So let's run the health check one so we can see how that works. All right, we'll do the same thing here. And notice that I'm not using any special paths. The only thing I'm going to do is use a different port. All right, so we can see that the application name is health check, and we can see that we got OK from it. So look, we got two working binaries, and I got a static file. We're going to zoom past all the documentation. Docs were pretty good here. I was able to read the docs and come up with a config file. So basically, what I want to do is log everything to standard out. I'm going to have my NGINX Unit process run on 8080. And then here's where things get interesting. Instead of in my application, or my monolithic application, instead of me figuring out routes and then routing everything, I can do everything to NGINX. So when I think about application servers, this is a pretty dope feature. Instead of me complicating my app, making it more complex, I'm just going to push all of that logic where it belongs, in the proxy. So here I got a couple of routes. First one is, if something comes in for index.html, well, we're just going to serve a static file. Ideally, that static file will live under opt static index.html. If you just come with a normal path, just a blank path, then I'm going to route you to that hello world application. And if you call /health, then I'm just going to route you to that independent binary that's just running health checks. So 3 different things that I'm trying to do here: server static file, respond hello world, and respond with health checks. Now, look, I spent a lot of time in the serverless world, and this has been one of the key components of being a serverless application. Do very few things, write less code as possible, and let the infrastructure around you handle all the complexity. Now, down here is where I wire up my applications. Now, this is where things get a little bit simple. I just copy these binaries into a particular path, notify them that they're external, give them a name, and ideally what will happen is NGINX Unit will stop or start and stop these applications for me based on requests that come in. Now, this is going to be really convenient because, like I said, my goal is to get this application, all 3 of those things, inside of a single container without a whole bunch of complexity. But in order to do that, we're going to have NGINX Unit do the heavy lifting. this is actually changing the way I want to think about writing applications. Now I can write really small binaries like I used to do back in the day, like when we had CGI. You would write a little script, you would put it in the directory, and you would let NGINX do its thing. But now it's 2022, I can actually use my favorite programming language and actually just drop in a full binary and let NGINX do the same thing. So let's see if that works. First thing I'm going to do is try to run things locally. So before we get it into a container and deploy it to the service environment, I'm one of those people who still like to write code locally. So this is what we're going to do now. So to do that, I'm just going to run nginx in the foreground, not in the daemon mode. And then I'm going to load this configuration just to make sure we have all the right settings. So the first thing we want to do here is I'm going to synchronize those binaries and just going to copy them into a place where nginx can pick them up, mainly user local bin hello world on my local machine. All right, so I have to use sudo to do this, type in my password, and now we should have those binaries in the right place. All right, next let's start NGINX Unit. All right, so we're going to run it without the daemon, and so it sets us up and running. Let's also tell the logs just to make sure we can see what's happening. Now, this is a good sign. The first thing you can see here is that both of my apps are starting. I put a little log message in there. So you can see starting hello world service, starting the health check service. So it looks like NGINX is doing its job. It detected that it's going to be responsible for these two applications and it started them up in the background. All right, so far so good. Now, given that, we can take those same curl commands. So instead of port 9090 and 9091, we're just going to do port 8080 this time. And remember, if I just hit it with the slash, we should get our hello world. But this time, it's actually coming from the NGINX server. And then the same thing is true if I use health. Again, I don't have to switch ports here because NGINX is doing all the heavy lifting. So we call health, same thing. I get OK as a response, and we can see the application type is health check. But remember, we're also serving static files here. So if that's working, I should be able to actually come over here, open a new tab, and see the web page come up for Hello World. All right, all three things are working. Now, the next thing I want to do is to see if I can package all of this up. Remember, there's a lot of moving pieces here, so I can run it on a serverless environment. Now, if you look at the documentation, you can totally run this on something like a VM, same profile. Put your binaries in the right place, put your config in the right place, and get NGINX up and running. There you go. The other thing that I like about running this under NGINX, notice I'm getting some logs. That's one thing I didn't put into my application. I actually skipped that part. So this is a good example of me writing less code and letting the proxy, in this case, the application server, do the heavy lifting for me. So I'm getting logs for free. There's more stuff you can do, SSL certificates, you name it, but this is a small taste of what it means to write less code and get more value from using a framework or an application server. All right, so let's shut that down. Now I'm going to walk you through the Docker file. Now, this is the part that took me the most time to get right. So if you look at this, what I'm doing here is I'm starting from my Go programming language base image. Now, the NGINX Unit team does have their own base image, but look, I really wanted to learn how this works, so I skipped using that for now. What I'm going to do instead is install NGINX Unit using the documentation as if I was on a VM. So I'm just going to be installing everything from scratch. The first thing I'm going to do is copy in the source files for that NGINX binaries, Debian packages in this case, install NGINX Unit using the apt-get tool. I'm also going to install the dev libraries because in order to build my Go application, I'm actually going to have to bind to C libraries in order to make all the magic that NGINX Unit does behind the scene actually work. So I'm going to make sure that those libraries get installed as well. Next thing I'm going to do here is copy over all of my Go programs. Remember, I got two separate binaries doing their own thing independently. And all I'm going to do is copy those things in and then compile those binaries, copying the results in the same directory that I was doing on my local laptop. Once those binaries are in place, I'm copying over that static file. You ask me, why is this static file thing a big deal? Well, let's say I wanted to serve this static file in my own app. Well, that's where things get a little challenging. In that scenario, I would actually have to write some more Go code to do that. And honestly, while Go does have support for serving static files, it isn't optimized for it. And also, it doesn't even have the same routing capabilities out of the box. I'll have to go get like another third-party library to even make that work. So instead of writing all this extra code and mounting files, binding them into my app in some weird kind of way, I could just push all of that out to NGINX and do things like what normally do on the VM, again, in an application container. So again, another example of saving a whole bunch of time. I think that's pretty dope. The next thing, I'm just going to copy over that nginx config file that we saw earlier. Remember, that's the thing that's doing all of the logic, listening to the right port, logging to standard out, and mapping the different URLs to my different applications or static files. So we'll copy that in the container too. We'll give Docker a little heads up on what's happening. And then what we'll do is the exact same thing I did on my laptop. Look, as a developer, I love working and doing my local development experience. I love even more when I can port what I learned on my laptop straight into the container that will end up running in production. So if you look here, it's going to be the exact same command that I ran on my desktop. If everything works, I'm just going to end up with a new container image that will run in a registry. To save a little bit of time, I've already pushed it up to a container registry. So we're going to pop over and I'll show you what that looks like here in a second. All right. We got a couple more steps to see if this actually pans out. So got everything working on my laptop. I built a new container image and just pushed it to a container repository. Now this is standard Docker stuff here. I take that Docker file, I run a script to do a Docker build that then pushes this up into this repository. So at this point, I can actually start to pull this image into any runtime. I can run it in Docker on my laptop. I can run it in Kubernetes. I can run it in a VM, or in this case, I'm going to run it in a serverless platform called Cloud Run. So that's the Docker string that I want here. Now, my goal is to get this into a runtime, bundling up all of that logic, all of that complexity, and then just using it in a serverless service. I'm going to show you that script real quick so you can see what that takes. All right, so let's move this up a little bit. And I'm going to go over to my script, and I'm going to show you what my deploy script looks like. All right, here's a single command. So number one, I want to deploy to Google Cloud's Cloud Run service. I'll use this command. I'll give it a name called Hello World. I'm going to allow you to hit it without authentication. And then I'm going to take that Docker image that I built using that Docker file, and I'm going to use that to deploy. Now, given that NGINX can actually do multiple things in parallel, I'm going to set concurrency to 10. So that means I can hold multiple concurrent requests at the same time. Next, you'll see I'm setting CPU to 2. I'm giving it a bit of memory. And I was going to do this little cool thing is, given how efficient NGINX is, I'm going to actually allow it to run with a minimum instance of 1 and allow it to scale to 3. I'm going to listen on the same port that we had in our Docker file, 8080. And then I'm going to make sure that the CPU doesn't get throttled, just to make sure things like logs and any background processing were to work. Now, if I were to run this command on my local machine, what will happen? Let's just do it now. Script, deploy. And so what we're going to do now, we're going to pull that container in, create a new revision, and I'm going to get another URL. Now, if this is all working, maybe, just maybe, NGINX Unit checks all of my requirements. Remember, my goal was to create very simple applications, maybe even write smaller applications, knowing that I can move things like routing, static file serving to a URL. And then also I can dynamically configure that, or if I have a config that's ready to go, I can just drop it on the file system. So let's see. First thing we're going to do is click on this URL to see if the static file hosting works. All right. Static hosting works. We're serving an HTML page with the words hello world. Next, let's check out the next piece of functionality. So what we want here is we want to be able to call curl to see if we can actually have NGINX running in a serverless container actually call both of those web services that are running in the background. So the first thing we're going to do is just hit the URL directly, and you can see that it's calling hello world. If I do a -I here, you can see all the additional headers that are coming from the Google front end because it's running in that serverless environment. But notice the application name is hello world. All right, one more check to see if this is actually working well. Can it mount to this other application? Notice the cool thing about this. I know for a fact that Cloud Run and most serverless environments, there is no way they'll let me run multiple binaries in the background binding to separate ports. You just can't do that into some of these serverless limited runtimes. But if this actually works, that means NGINX is actually doing the right thing here. It's proxying using a lower level protocol between my application. So it's not going to assume they can establish another HTTP socket. It's going to do its own thing to send data to that application and to return the response to the caller. And you can see it here. Application name is health check, and we got back okay. So at this point, I got to say, I think NGINX checks all the boxes in this case. One thing I didn't show you is if I wanted to push that config locally, I could have actually just used curl instead of a tool like Motorboat. And NGINX Unit actually has a RESTful interface where I can just push that config file. And the cool thing about this, it will just hot reload while it's in place. In serverless environments, I don't know if I would necessarily recommend you do it that way. I would probably bundle the config in the container image or have it be mounted in at runtime. But if you're in a world like Kubernetes and using NGINX Unit for a sidecar, I think this totally makes sense, especially if you're using a control plane to manage all your proxies. I'm pretty sure a lot of you all have questions, and the best way I think to kind of answer some of those questions is maybe we jump into a slightly different format. Maybe we jump into a fireside chat. In order to do that, I'm going to introduce Rob to the stage. Hey, Rob.
Hey, Kelsey. Thank you so much. That was awesome. So appreciate you taking the time to join us at Sprint and put that little demo together. One thing that I find really impressive is we did not assist you in any way, shape, or form. You said, nope, I'm going to go about this as if I was looking at this fresh, just like anyone in the audience would. So I think that ended up came out really cool what you did. So first of all, thank you. I guess that's the first thing I'll say. I appreciate you taking that time. Look, I've got a million questions, and so I'm looking forward to kind of digging in here. But let me just start with, you made a point that you actually spoke at one of our conferences some years ago. How has your opinion, if any, of NGINX changed? I mean, you kind of looked at it through a technical lens, but did you come into this project with sort of a preconceived notion of NGINX, and did it alter at all once you got to know Unit a little bit better?
Well, yeah, I mean, back then it was like, NGINX was going more to the proprietary side of things, right? And so that left this door open for all these new projects like Service Mesh and Envoy, right? All of these newer projects were focused on dynamic configuration, being lightweight, and really embracing this new pattern that we've got in the cloud native world, which is the proxy should just become a bit smaller and a bit more dynamic and actually sit in front of any application stack. And 7 years ago, when I wrote that tool called Motorboat, I didn't get the impression that NGINX was going to follow that particular path. It felt like they were just going to double down on what they were already doing, and the ecosystem would have to kind of brute force functionality around it. And I think getting acquired by F5 was also something that muddied the waters. And I know a lot of people, if you're like me, you're like, okay, now what happens next? And so I was kind of taken aback and surprised a bit when a few years ago, not just the acquisition by F5, but also that NGINX Unit was born. And you all decided to do it open source. And so, of course, I was kind of happy that it only took me about a day or two to actually go from the docs to actually rethinking the way I develop applications to take the value out of NGINX Unit. So yeah, I had preconceived notions, but look, the documentation, first class. Didn't have to have an enterprise description to plow through the docs. Great open source libraries for my language, of course, Golang. And so I think really that kind of proves to me that maybe, just maybe, you're listening to the community. You kind of understand where the patterns are going and really not just copying what was already out there, because maybe that's kind of what I expected. When I pulled up NGINX Unit, I thought it was just going to be a clone of like Linkerd or Envoy. But what I noticed was that you actually went one step further. And is really around this whole thing around application management. It wasn't just a raw proxy. It was like, hey, there's a much more efficient way to have bidirectional communication with an app and also do that thing that I thought was really amazing back in the day. How do you just lay down multiple versions of an app in different programming languages in a simple directory structure, and then just have the proxy do all the process management? And the last thing I'll say here, I didn't even get into the fact that NGINX actually replicates a lot of the functionality that I saw in Docker, like making sure that two processes run as different users. You can sandbox them using the same container technology. So that made me think that someone really put their hands on this, didn't focus only on cloud native, never forgot about this current world of on-prem and virtualization.
Wow, that's awesome. I appreciate that. And, just again, for me, part of why we were excited to reach out to you was we do have a goal of trying to get back to, I'll be blunt, kind of the what got us here in the first place. I think as a company struggling to kind of prove commercial success, you could run a risk of moving away from your open source roots. I think we did. And I think we're trying to get back to that. And Unit has been sort of a labor of love to get back to some of those core roots. And so I'm glad that was authentic as you kind of went through and discovered that a little bit. So it sounds like there was a lot of good stuff. I'd be remiss if I didn't give you an opportunity, though, to say, well, what were what stumbling blocks did you hit? And if you have advice for things that we could be doing better, I'd love to hear not just the good, but maybe even some of the bad.
Yeah, so I would say the opportunity for improvement to me these days is straight up developer experience. And so, look, I love the fact that I can just use curl to manage the config. I think every API should work that way, but I don't think that's where API should actually stop. So I think having a good command line tool that lets people just kind of run like nginx unit config and make it just much easier to understand how to find that socket, what these things actually mean, maybe hide a little bit of that complexity from a user. And I think also doubling down on extension points. So I think these days, if you're going to sit at that layer, the number one question I think you got to ask is, how many things can I make go away for the developer? So the one thing I didn't see from the docs was, how do I integrate with things like Open Policy Agent? So if you just think about the lifecycle of a request, we know it's going to hit my proxy, but before it gets to my application, I wouldn't mind having some policy evaluated using some of these open source things in the ecosystem. So imagine having nginx Unit support more kind of external plugins, even if that competes with your commercial stuff. But I think if you do that, then you'll bring in that ecosystem. And I think that ecosystem is kind of the thing that might be missing when you kind of dig into the details. But you start adding things like the ecosystem layers and plugins, now you start to really open yourself up to creativity. You'll watch people start to mix and match different layers of the stack. Because I think at the end of the day, if you really can make it where all I have to do is write simple HTTP endpoints and then delegate the rest to the application framework. And look, I work with a lot of other developers. I've been at a lot of other companies. And the hardest thing to do is for every company, for every team, depending on what language they're writing in, to get that stuff to be consistent. So the fact that you already got this head start by supporting Node.js, Python, Golang, and the whole nine, you can go one step further by just making sure that when we do decide to do things like chaos engineering or policy management, make that plugin super easy without making it too complex. Then I think you can go a long way. The last thing, as a Go developer, it broke my heart that there was C-Go dependencies. I was tweeting, I didn't mention Nginx by name, but boy, I actually got lost for a few minutes, like trying to figure out how to compile my Go app, right? It was working before. I did the drop-in replacement, and then the C compiler started yelling at me. I'm like, I'm not writing C for a reason. And so I get it. Maybe it's there for performance. But look, if you're going to have a C-Go dependency, especially for Golang, you got to have an entire documentation section that actually tells people what to do. And I'll have it on GitHub and actually figured it out. If you do brew install unit, then all of those C libraries are going to go into a particular path. All you got to do is set 2 environment variables for Go build. And it's going to work just like that.
That's great. And actually, if I try to tie 2 things together, let me step back. Developer experience, completely agree with you there. But I think we sometimes struggle with, well, what does that mean? I think you just gave a really good example where developer experience, where you come in with an expectation or a thought, and then you have to go spend all this extra time. I think some developers are creative and love to really puzzle this stuff out. Some people just want to get on with it and write the app. And so I think that's good. But let me ask you, just as a follow-up, what do you define as developer experience? Is it just making it joyful to use, or is it more about how quickly do I get to the task I'm trying to accomplish? Like, what's the metric we should focus on?
So there's the day zero experience. And I think a lot of people over index developer experience on the day zero. I'm just getting started. So everything is all about hello world style stuff, simple configurations, onboarding docs. Look, I love that stuff too. But for me, I want that day three experience to be good. So when you start to have command line tools that help me debug a configuration, like I don't know why the configuration isn't working. I don't know what fields are even available. To me, that's great developer experience. Anything to help me actually troubleshoot is also great developer experience. Also, just saving me time. So if I have a complex application, everyone's looking to modernize, bring in new techniques to their stack, what's the experience going to be look like? Am I have to do this for 5 different languages? Or can I do it one time and therefore creating an amazing developer experience for my entire organization? So just keep in mind that sometimes the developer experience is not the one that you give directly to the one developer. It's enabling one developer to give great experience to like 1,000 other developers. So don't be afraid of a little bit of complexity, especially if it accomplished what I just mentioned.
Got it. Okay. Wow, that's really good. And by the way, that's something that we debate internally all the time is developer experience. And I think we're actually guilty of exactly what you just said, which is you fixate a lot on that day zero. It's how do we get someone up and running productively?
Now I'll tell you that whoever did that config file, it is fantastic. Between the docs and the right parameters, even though it's JSON, I was able to actually write it by hand. And that's usually hard to do. And trust me, there are other projects out there that if you try, you can't even write the config by hand anymore. You actually have to use a control plane. So whoever came up with that is very easy to follow. And it's almost as easy as the old school NGINX configs back in the day that just really focused on people writing them by hand. I think they got the balance right between having something that's machine generable and human readable and something you can actually write by hand. So thumbs up to whoever did that.
Okay, awesome. I will make sure that the team gets credit. I suspect it was Artem, but I'll have to double check on who did that. Okay, so how about this? As we were kind of going through, one of the things that occurred to me is we're beginning to proliferate some of the open source projects. We're not just the eponymous kind of web server and proxy UC unit. At this event, we're talking about a few other things we're doing. But one of the themes is we are trying to go up the stack more into that control plane. And you just mentioned that. Do you think that's something there's appetite for developers, or do you actually prefer that tools be more elegant and not necessarily need control and management layers on top of them?
Just make it composable, full stop. And so for me, if you get that curl experience right, you do things like extensions, and then those extensions also are able to be configured through the same mechanism, then you're going to get a whole world of creativity. And I think Kubernetes is one of the best examples of a piece of software, as complex as it is, its ecosystem for extensions is second to none. And so when you think about a control plane, if I can build my own control plane with Bash, right, just a bunch of shell scripts that generate the right config, drop all the right plugins in place, then it's easy for me to understand. But then you open up this nice ecosystem that maybe NGINX and F5 is the right company to provide the global universal control plane. But guess what? Kubernetes is going to be a part of that control plane stack. Then Kubernetes can do really cool things like have a controller take services from Kubernetes and stitch them into NGINX Unit. So one test I would do is say, hey, what is this experience like without the control plane? If someone were to build their own control plane, how hard would that be? And then, of course, you can go offer value on top, which is observability, giving people metrics, pretty dashboards, security, and policy. But don't consider just the raw fact of having in place where you can have an API to configure a bunch of things. That's not where 100% of the value is, even though it is valuable.
Got it. Okay, great. Well, excellent. I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I think this has been really illustrative. I just have a few kind of wrap-up questions. I'm going to ask you an unfair one first. put yourself in my shoes for a day, right? So what would you invest in if you were running NGINX? Could be anything: people, process, tools, documentation, new tech. What is it that would excite you if you heard that NGINX was working on something?
Yeah, I would definitely just go figure out across all the new modern development techniques, where are people spending the most time? Is it trying to do service mesh things? Is it trying to do observability? Is it trying to offload things like TLS mutual auth? Right? These are just things that developers are struggling with. Go understand how they're doing it currently, and then what it would take to translate that to something that runs in things like NGINX Unit. And think about a magical experience. You can actually parse certain code bases and just generate the NGINX Unit file automatically. So to me, I would really be doubling down on how do we make applications simpler? And then when that complexity is removed from the app, it needs to be easy to go to the layer above. And I think that's NGINX Unit. And then, of course, you got to document the hell out of that. So that means, and I looked through the docs, and that's a piece of feedback, no more code snippets. I need to see the whole thing, right? So if you're going to ask me to come from this programming language, doing it the native way in that language, well, you got to show me the whole thing, make sure that it works. And then you got to show me the parallel inside of your config and what things need to do, because that kind of knowledge, once a person gets it, then they can go share it with someone else, and then it becomes the de facto standard. So I would really kind of double down, making Unit what it says. It's a unit, a part of a whole. And that's the last thing I would probably say. Given that it's just a unit, where would that unit be slotted in? How easy is it to run on a VM? How easy is it to run inside of Cloud Run? How easy is it to run inside of Kubernetes and Nomad and all the others? Make sure that that is super easy to do, because then you get this progressive adoption pattern, right? Some people will use all the features. Some people will only care about 2 features because it saves them the most time when adopting one of the bigger platforms around it. So don't be shy. NGINX can just be a unit of the whole. Just know what that is.
Okay, awesome. That actually took care of one of my other questions. So you're on a roll now. So how about this? I'm going to end on this. This event, of course, we were focusing on NGINX Tech because I think some folks come to learn about what we're up to. But I'd also love this just to be an event where they can come hear folks like you, where they might not necessarily get to do that all the time. And you're obviously well known in the Kubernetes ecosystem. What advice do you have for someone who's maybe tuning in? It can be about anything. It doesn't have to be about NGINX. Just advice that you would give to fellow developers that are out there right now.
Focus on the fundamentals. One thing that was really cool for the last 2 days is I was really digging deep to NGINX, and I'll throw my code on GitHub so you all can kind of check out what I was doing. I like to just take a step back and ask myself, what are the fundamentals of writing an application? And I took so much boilerplate out of my app, things like binding an SSL certificate, things like dealing with routes. That stuff can just get overwhelming and too complex. So when you're looking at a new tool, maybe NGINX Unit is going to be new to you, think about the fundamentals. Why do we have these different routing techniques and paths? Why is serving static files so hard and every proxy doesn't support it? You would think that would be the first thing that would be there. Go understand why. Again, focus on the fundamentals. If you're focused on the fundamentals, I think you actually start building apps slightly better. Keep them small, keep them focused on just performing tasks. And then you would ask yourself, well, where do you put the rest of the boilerplate? Great. Now you can think in layers. Is Kubernetes the right place to put some of the logic? Is NGINX the right place to put some of the logic? And that answer will come super clear if you understand the fundamentals. So my advice to people would be, no matter if you're using tool X or tool Y, get the fundamentals right, then you can make the tool actually work for you.
Love it. Well, thank you, Kelsey. This has been great. I mean, just my on the cuff, because this is the first time I even got to see this demo from you. It was sort of a grand reveal, if you will. I think part of what I'm taking away from this is I think when we first positioned Unit in the market, and by the way, the gentleman who started Unit, Igor Sosoyev, is the guy who started NGINX. So it's another project of his where it was positioned as a polyglot app server. And I think what I'm learning is, okay, yes, there's maybe some element of that, but really there's a simplification where it's part of a larger ecosystem where we can offload some of the repetitive infrastructure tasks. And then it really just provides, in this case, you didn't even use other languages, you just used Go, but still found a way to kind of simplify the life of the developer, and the ultimately what our mission statement is performance. And so we want to make that app perform well and make sure that you're running the right function in the right place.
To me, these days, open source also means bringing an ecosystem with you. It used to be open and I can change it. Then it needs to be accessible and APIs. Now I think the ecosystem plays. So if Unit can become a bridge between the app I'm writing and all the stuff in the ecosystem, that's when you take off.
Awesome. Excellent. Well, I think this has accomplished everything I was hoping. Again, thank you so much for taking the time and sharing kind of your own passion and enthusiasm. So hopefully it's not another, 5 or 6 years before we invite you back, but it was at least great to have you for this event. So again, many thanks.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Rob.